All right. Well, welcome everybody to our webinar. My name is Chris Meny. I am the content manager and director of website development for Gold Biotechnology. Gold Bio is a supplier of proven, published, and affordable reagents and chemicals for research labs and small businesses all over the world. We specialize in thousands of day-to-day reagents that you need for the lab, but at affordable rates that you can discover more. Check out our website for all of our products at goldbio.com. Our webinar today is called 10 Sustainable Things that Every Lab Can Start Doing Right Now with Dr. Fanny Ewan. Dr. Ewan is passionate about sustainable science. She helps both industrial and academic labs develop science-based action plans that minimizes their carbon footprint without compromising their great research. She has also founded the Green Your Lab movement, a free network offering knowledge and expertise to help in every lab on every budget go green. Hi, Dr. Ewan. Welcome to our webinar.
Hi, Chris. Thank you.
All right. So if you want to start sharing the screen, and I will mute myself and take off video.
Is my screen showing? Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Fanny, and today we're going to talk about how to green your lab. So as Chris was saying, I'm part of an organization called greenyourlab.org. It's a free network for you to join where you can get some more information about how you can be sustainable in your workplace. So the first question you might ask is, what is Green Labs? So Green Lab is a movement where we're trying to make science more sustainable. Research work is extremely energy, water, and waste intensive. And we want to change that. It's actually really surprising to know that at academic institutions, we produce about 12 billion pounds of plastic waste per year. I'm from Vancouver, and that's enough to cover all of Vancouver up above my head every single year. A lab will use 10 times as much energy and 6 times as much water. We believe that we can change that without actually changing the scientific integrity of our experiments. So 10 actions for you that you can do today. So number 1 is to start the discussion. Of course, you can be green all on your own, but it is so much more fun if you include other people. So many of the easy changes are behavioral. That means if you can get other people to join the cause, the impacts will be multiplied. For a lot of scientists, just simply talking about the environment may be enough to get them to make changes. They may already be in the lab thinking to themselves, oh my gosh, I just spent a day in tissue culture and I have 3 bins of plastic biohazard waste sitting there, all from me. And they're looking for a way to change. That's easy. But for other people, a different argument might be needed. For example, somebody who cares a lot about the dollars and cents might really like to hear that fume hoods consume the energy of 3.5 households, but simply by closing the sash on it after you're done, you actually save 1.5 households worth of energy. That hits your bottom line, saves money from your energy bill right away. And this simple action of simply just closing that sash after you're done is all it takes. Other people might enjoy some great PR. So maybe you can run a competition where you check, and the labs that close the sash on their fume hood the most often get their name in the department newsletter. Or maybe those labs can go through the LEAF certification process and they can broadcast that now they're LEAF certified as a green lab. Or they can join the International Freezer Challenge, where the winners get their photo in Nature. Maybe that person cares about safety. Well, going back to our fume hood example, if you shut the sash on that fume hood, if anything catastrophic happens in the fume hood while you're away or you've stepped away, then that is kept contained in the fume hood. So actually, safety and sustainability can be hand in hand. Maybe your company cares that there might be some regulatory risk coming. In the US, they're talking a lot about the green chemistry legislation. And in some states, there have been single-use plastic bans, including publicly funded labs. And so instead of running around panicking when the legislation comes in, if you haven't been affected yet, maybe already look at planning for that, because then you can be ready when it does come. Another one is consistent culture. Most scientists want to do good, and some of us might even care a lot about sustainability in our normal lives. We might already be vegans or vegetarians or do crazy things like take the rainwater off our roofs. But somehow, when we go into the lab, the first thing we might end up doing is pouring down 4 liters of dichloromethane into the waste. Why is it that the person I am at work can't be the full self? And why can't my workplace be one that I can be proud of, that is sustainable? And for companies, if they can improve that, that means better employee retention. So look for the right argument in order to get your green team involved. Like I said, the more people you get involved, that means the benefits are multiplied. Next is don't be afraid to question. So many of our processes and procedures are passed on from one generation to the next. Everything I learned, a postdoc passed on to me, but so rarely do we get a chance to ask, why? Why are these the instructions I was given? So one of my favorite ladies is Dr. Grace Hopper. She was the first female to receive a PhD in mathematics. She was a Navy software engineer, and she invented the first software compiler. She's also the one that came up with the phrase, it's better to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission. So I'm sure you've heard of her. She has a wonderful quote. The most dangerous phrase in the language is, we've always done it this way. She continues, humans are allergic to change. I try to fight that. That's why I have a clock on my wall that runs counterclockwise. So we really want to encourage scientists to ask why. So the first question is, why is your -80 freezer or your ULT freezer, ultra low temperature freezer, set at -80? Why is it called a -80? Does it need to be at -80? How many of us have gone into the lab and asked those questions? When I arrived into my first biolab, I just assumed that was what somebody had figured out was the optimal temperature and it had to be that temperature. But actually, I have yet to see any scientific evidence of why the number -80 is so important. And a lot of older scientists might actually remember a time when they were called -70s and even at some point -60s. So we're really trying to encourage scientists to think about it. Do you actually need your freezer to be at -80? Because if you can set it at -70, that saves up to 30% of the energy. The theory is that actually it's a marketing ploy is what happened, is that manufacturers came out with these -80 freezers. They were able to get to -80 and they convinced us that we needed them, that that's what would store our samples best. But the research is increasingly showing that actually storing it at -70 gives you the same sample integrity. So go and question why your freezer is set at the temperature that it's set at. And what's really interesting is I was talking to some collaborators in Australia. In my lab, we have -20 freezers as well. Their -20 freezers are actually set at -30. I asked wasting more electricity than they had to. The next one is plastic use. So especially going into a biolab, I reasoned to myself, it's because we need the sterility. That's why we need to use all of this plastic. I felt guilty every day, but I kept doing it anyway. So it wasn't until I started writing up my thesis and going through and looking through all of the papers and trying to identify the original procedures and where they came from so that I could cite the original source. And I noticed I was looking at procedures from the 1950s, 1940s, even some back as far as the 1930s. It made me think, wait a second. All of those were before we had such convenient plastics. They didn't use plastics for their experiments. Why is it that I think I absolutely need them? I'm not saying that science hasn't advanced since then, but sometimes we just need to think again and think about why is it that we use so much? And do we actually need it? Is there something else we can do about it? So I encourage everybody to ask why. The third one sounds super obvious, but surprisingly, so few labs do it, and that is switch it off. If you're not using the equipment, turn it off. We suggest that you go in with your lab mates and look at each piece of equipment that's plugged into the wall and say, yes, this piece of equipment can be turned off every single time you use it. Or, no, this piece of equipment should only be turned off at the end of the day. And there are some pieces of equipment, maybe with a little red tag that says, do not turn off, like your fridges and freezers. And then have a little rota where maybe one member of the lab goes at 5 p.m. and circles the lab and takes a look and to see what is still on and to turn them all off. And if you need that piece of equipment on for that day, for that evening, you're responsible for putting a note there saying, do not turn off. And this is what we want to encourage, is this reverse psychology where instead of thinking, okay, everything should be left on all the time, it's you need to do something, you need to take an action if you want that piece of equipment to be left on instead. It doesn't sound like a lot, but what I was really surprised about was something that happened in my lab. We had a drying oven that was on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was never switched off. So I put a little meter in where we looked at how much energy it was consuming. And then I changed that afterwards with a timer, an automatic timer that turned off the oven at about 5:30 in the afternoon, once everybody's going home, and then turns it back on about 6:30 a.m. so that it warms up in time for everybody getting back in. So during the whole day, whole work day, that oven remains on. But just that simple action, we found out that saves 1.4 tons per year of carbon dioxide equivalent. That one little oven. They say approximately the US person's entire life's footprint, your personal life footprint, is about 10 to 15 tons CO2 equivalent per year. So that one oven can save 1.4 tons just by setting it to turn off in the evening and turn back on in the morning. Think about the number of ovens you have in your lab, in your building, at your campus, and in the world. So doing small things, such as this $10 meter that I put in, allows us to save a lot of greenhouse gases. The next is to reduce, reuse, and recycle. A lot of us think that in the lab, especially a bio one, you're unable to do any of that. We're taught this mantra when we were younger, and we try to do it well in our personal lives. But somehow, once we go into the lab, we think, nope, can't be done. We're challenging that. So the first, you should always do it in that order: reduce, then reuse, and then recycle. So when it comes to reduction, think before you act. So think about your experiments, what you have to do, and see how many repeats do you actually need? And what is the sample size you need? Can you make it smaller? Can you reduce? then is to reuse. So there's a lot of plasticware where you are actually able to wash it out and reuse it, especially the good quality ones. They can even be autoclaved. Yes, they say single use on them, but we've actually had a lot of luck being able to autoclave them as well, so that you can actually have sterile plasticware back out again. And the last is to recycle. There actually are some companies who are taking back previously biologically contaminated waste. So you have to probably sterilize it before you give it to them. And there are even some companies out there now that are taking biohazardous waste, contaminated biohazardous waste off your hands. So look for some of these recyclers. Number 5 is cold storage. So be good to your freezers and fridges. Most labs have freezers and fridges, and if yours doesn't, I encourage you to take all of these tips back home to your fridge and freezer at home. So number 1 is to do preventative maintenance. Some of the very simple ones are to vacuum the coils in the back. So I don't know if you've noticed, but pretty much every fridge and freezer in the back has a set of coils. If they're covered in dust, they're not doing their heat transfer effectively. And essentially, you're just wasting electricity for no reason. The second is to always check the seals around. Make sure that they're soft and supple and not cracked. Any cracks means that air, cold air, is just seeping out. The second is to do a fridge and freezer inventory. So I do this at home. Every fridge and freezer, I have a white sheet of paper, very simple. And when I put something in, I go and mark down what I put in and the approximate location it's where it is. And when I take it out, I cross it off. And so I always know what's in my fridge and freezer without having to look in it, because actually just opening the lid or the door of the freezer lets out a lot of that cold air that's been accumulated. And it takes a lot of energy to get it back down to temperature. So if you know exactly where your items are and what you're looking for, open the door, grab it, and get out of there as soon as possible. And that's a great way to save. For labs, there are some more sophisticated softwares that you might be interested in, and a lot of them are free for academic use. Some that have very sophisticated systems where you can even barcode all of your samples and track exactly in which box and in which container that they're located in. Number 3 is to regularly defrost. If you have ice buildup, the freezer looks smaller and gets smaller. And in addition, that frost buildup, that ice buildup can actually then go along the seal and not let you close the door properly, again, letting out cold air. Number 4 is to do an annual clean out. We all have stuff in our freezer that has been in there too long, whether it is a sample that's no longer labeled and we don't know what it is, or that steak that's super freezer burnt that we think that we might try to eat one day. So do an annual cleanup, go through it. If you don't need it, stop storing it. And therefore, if you clean them out, you might find room for the next set of samples so that you don't need to buy a new freezer. Number 5 is to check your operating temperatures. So we already talked about the difference between -70 versus -80 and -20 versus -30. But here's another question. Is your freezer actually running at its set point? A lot of freezers only have the number on the front, which indicates the set point that you set it at. But is it actually that temperature inside? You might want to put in a little thermometer if it doesn't already have one. And if it has one, to ensure you clean the ice off of that thermometer, because ice buildup on that thermometer can alter the temperature reading by about 5 degrees. Number 6 is to look for room temperature storage or just higher temperature storage. So there might be kits that you can buy where you're supposed to store it in your -80, but maybe there's a different version, an equivalently good version, where you can say store it at room temperature or store it at 4 degrees. Choose that. If you choose the ones that are stored at a higher temperature, then you make room in your -80s for something that's more precious. And this happens in food as well. I was looking at for spring roll pastry the other day. I saw a version that is in the freezer, and I saw another version dry that you just dip in water before you wrap your spring rolls in. Both very tasty. Number 7 is sharing and caring. Well, sharing is caring. So if your freezer is not full, consider asking around and seeing if other people who don't have a lot of samples, can put their samples in your freezer and shut their freezer down. The fewer freezers that are running and the fewer freezers that are purchased, the better. And number 8 is to buy an energy efficient freezer. Yes, sometimes they can be a little more expensive, but over its lifetime, the savings you will get from the less energy usage, will actually gain you money at the end. So we talked a little bit about sharing freezers, but this goes across for chemicals as well as equipment. So for equipment, a lot of equipment in our labs are not used consistently all the time, right? There's some leeway where somebody can nip in and do a few samples. And that means those people don't have to go and buy, let's say, their own spectrophotometer, because they can just borrow yours for those few samples. The fewer items that you purchase, the less embodied carbon there is, because it actually takes so much energy to make and manufacture those pieces of equipment and ship it to you. So share. Look for national databases where there's equipment available for you to actually borrow. And when you don't need a piece of equipment anymore and it's hogging up space in your lab, don't just chuck it away. Donate it. Look for underprivileged schools or other labs. And also, seeding labs also then can take some of that equipment and send it off to developing countries that really need it. Chemicals as well. Have a chemicals database where you know what all the chemicals are that are available. And if you see it and you need something, you can say, hey, look, I really need some of this. I only need a couple milliliters. Can you spare some? And that person might say, yeah, that's fine. Or no, I'm going to use it, but because mine is more short dated, I don't need it for a while. You can replace it for me. So you can use theirs, that's going to be short dated, and buy them a longer date one, and therefore extending the lifetime of the chemicals. And the next is donating. So KAUST University, for example, has a system where researchers will put all of the chemicals they don't need anymore onto a database, and it's completely free for anybody else who'd like to use them. Number 7 is don't forget your computer. So a lot of us have been moving to a lot more computer work. And yes, in general, it's more sustainable to do modeling than to, say, do a lot of lab work, but your computers don't get a complete free pass. An email actually can cost between 4 and 50 grams of CO2 equivalent. So unsubscribe. All of that junk mail that's in your inbox, they're so super annoying. So press unsubscribe. Stop having them send it to you, because every time they send it to you, going through the servers is taking 4 grams of CO2 equivalent. Virtual meetings. So we're having so many virtual meetings. We're currently at one right now. They don't have a zero footprint. They're better than traveling, but it's not zero. And so I highly suggest that if you're in a really big seminar where the speaker can't even see you anyway, turn your camera off, because that decreases your carbon footprint by 96%. Also think about where your data is backed up. How many backup copies do you need? Sometimes if things are not so important, you don't have to back them up so many times, and things that are more important, you might want to have those backups. If they're backups that you know that you won't need for a long time, you might consider a physical hard drive that you only plug in when you need it. And things that you need often, they can go up into the cloud because those servers are on all the time. Another tip is to look at whether you can give your data a second life. So sharing your data. If your company allows, you might be able to share the data you've collected, both from your experiments as well as from your modeling. And that avoids someone from having to do it again. But what it requires is for you to properly label and document everything. If you have a spreadsheet and no headings up on the top, nobody can use that. Nobody can understand that. So make sure you're properly labeling all of that data. And the other one is, if possible, use software that's open source. Then you're not tied to those licenses. Other people who can't pay for the licenses or the software is no longer supported can still be able to open and access your data. Number 8 is, where are you going? So this was published in Ecological Indicators. And what they're saying is the carbon footprint of a 4-year PhD student. And most of it is from traveling to conferences and meetings. And if you see, if you decrease the number, if you turn all of that travel into online meetings, you actually cut that student's footprint by half. For some people, it's hard. We have been in this pandemic and we're just like, no more of these virtual conferences. Then I suggest trying something called a decentralized conference. So this is one where you have it in multiple locations and not just a single one. So my company had one. It was supposed to be a Europe-wide conference. We had one site in Germany, one site in Belgium, and one site in London. And what would happen is some of the talks would be live and some of them would be broadcasted. So for example, the day 1, the keynote might be in London and it's broadcasted to Brussels and Germany. Day 2, the keynote might be in Brussels and then it's broadcasted to Germany and London. So you get some of this live and you also get some of it virtual. And everybody only needs to travel to their closest hub. And within that hub, you continue to do your networking, your poster presentations and such like that. So you get both the conference that has, people and information coming from further away areas, but also that close networking without the intense travel of everybody traveling to one place. Also look at how you travel, right? Are we choosing to fly or are we choosing to take public transit? Can you say car share with somebody and decrease your carbon footprint that way? 9, coffee. So let's not forget that coffee, since coffee is such an integral part of our research mindset, what we're drinking. So I'm sure a lot of you already know that cows create a lot of methane and are very greenhouse gas intensive. So putting milk in your coffee is actually a huge chunk of that footprint. So if you can compare what black coffee is versus a latte. And also, how much water are you boiling? If you're boiling just the amount of water you need, or you're boiling the entire kettle and only using 1 cup. And the last is to have fun. Green Labs is supposed to be fun, and we want to encourage people to enjoy doing it. So have some competitions, get a little friendly competition going on where, you might ask people to, like I said before, maybe see how often you shut the sash, or who's going to be able to clear out the most freezers, who's producing the most waste in their lab. Celebrate those Green Lab champions. Tell them that they're doing a fantastic job, and also celebrate your successes together. Have a party and remind each other that, being green is fun and important, and just network that way. So I want to leave you with a very inspirational quote. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. I want to encourage all of you to try and start a Green Lab program in your lab. And I wanted to also take some time for any of those of you who are interested more about Green Labs, who want to learn more, come and join our network at greenyourlab.org. You can get an invitation there to our site. So I want to give you a little preview. This is the Green Eurolab network platform. Here, you'll find a number of ways where you can interact with our community. The first is through networking and seminars. We run a series of networking events where you can come and meet other Green Lab enthusiasts and sustainable scientists. You can go into our calendar and find out what other exciting activities are happening in the Green Lab, green chemistry, or sustainability space. We're very proud of our Green Lab best practices database. This database was built by other scientists for you, so you can get ideas of how you can go green. We cover topics such as waste, energy, water, infrastructure, green chemistry, specialty labs, and other. So for example, I know many of you are interested in what to do with your pipettes, the tips, and boxes. So this is what our members have already populated in our database. They've given you some ideas of how you might be able to reduce your pipette tip usage, how you might be able to reload your pipette tips from a bag quickly, switching to glass and reusables, or how you might be able to wash those pipette tips and pipettes. And also, great things that you can do with those pipette tip boxes. And finally, how you might be able to recycle them. All of our members will have the ability to go in and edit the database. This is a database made by Green Lab enthusiasts for Green Lab enthusiasts. Then we have our discussion forum. Sometimes the Green Lab database has enough information, but other times you just need a little bit more help. So here, our members discuss and ask questions about things that they'd like to learn more about, whether it's how long to leave your UV timer on in your biological cabinet, to how to dispose of ice packs, or using metal pipette tip boxes for the autoclave. And last, we have a section, sort of like a classified section, where you can post up projects or job postings, things that you'd like to collaborate with other people on. So thank you so much for your time today, and please join us on our mission to make science more sustainable.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ewan. That was amazing. So I really liked it, and I actually had one of the questions about pipette tips, and then you answered it very wonderfully for me. So the only questions I got is so one. Let's say, for instance, I have an old freezer in my lab. I mean, this thing is from the late 70s or early 80s. Do you recommend that we replace it with a more efficient, newer, more efficient freezer? Or is the cost offset from the manufacturing process of that?
So there are some more complicated calculations that you can actually make. But in general, we say, just as a rule of thumb, if you're looking just at sustainability and not looking at the energy, like the monetary energy savings, then we say keep the freezers for as long as you can, because just the extraction of all the materials and all of the shipping and just all of everything that had to be done to create that freezer, that embodied carbon is huge. And especially nowadays, we're getting to better and better. Okay, the US has some improvement to do, but better and better sources of electricity, more renewable. So that footprint is getting smaller in comparison. So yes, like I said, if you want to do a very detailed calculation, there are some, and you can, and you may find there is a point at which you should replace that freezer. But if you're not up for doing that, as a rule of thumb, keep it for as long as you can.
Okay, well, that makes sense. I mean, it's one, like you said, it's like if it's still working, then it probably is efficient. You can just continue, right?
Yeah. Just
So
make
the
sure that when you do dispose of it, that you're really careful about what happens to the refrigerants. Because some of those old
yeah,
freezers might have some of the old refrigerants in it,
right.
and so just be really careful in how that's disposed of.
Okay. Well, the other question I had was, so you were mentioning like reusing the plasticware and autoclaving it. Does your website have like recommended instructions for, like, is it different instructions for autoclaving those kind of one-use plastics that's still safe, but it, doesn't, but it's still effective?
Yeah, so in general, just basically, right? We reusing those plastics, washing them out tends to be
Mhm.
something in a low Virkon, ethanol, distol, something like that. And then we rinse them out and then we put them in the autoclave. Not all plastics can be are autoclavable. So we're starting to build a little database where people are putting in their successes and their failures. But sometimes, so there is some advice on there about, what types of plastics tend to do well, right?
Right,
Because
right.
different plastics have kind of a different melting temperature, and some of them always do poorly. But we just kind of say, wrap it up well, put it in the autoclave and see,
Yeah, right.
do a
Maybe,
little guess and test.
yeah,
Um,
maybe make sure you put them in some kind of definite autoclave tub if
Correct.
you're not sure, right?
Yes, in a bag of some sort. Of
Right,
course, yeah, because you don't what you'll end up getting is this melted mess at the bottom of your
right.
autoclave that you have to. No, that's not what we're advising. Smart,
Smart science.
smart tests here. But sometimes there are some items you just have to test them and see.
Awesome, awesome. Well, let's see. So as a student, what actions can you implement to convince your PI to get involved in the Green Lab?
Yeah, so this sounds like you might be okay, so if you are a undergrad student, then start having a chat with your lab coordinators and those lab managers in those training labs and say, hey, look, is this something that you might be interested in looking in? For
Mhm.
PhD students, you have a little more power. We find that PIs are usually really receptive if they're students who want to take it on, right? So if you're willing to do the work, then, and it's not going to cost them a lot of money, then
Mhm.
it's actually quite amenable for them to do it. And we talked about the different ways that you can kind of encourage them before, right? You can talk about the monetary savings that they might get, or the positive PR from getting that, Green Lab certificate, or winning a competition, or just the extra safety benefits. And
Right.
PIs want you to be happy, right? They want they want their students to do well. And if this is something that you want to do, a lot of them won't stand in your way, especially if it's not going to cost them more.
Right, right. All right. Well, that's all. I mean, that's amazing. So thank you for coming on with us and sharing your amazing things. To all the attendees, we will be this webinar is being saved, so we will be sending out a link probably sometime early next week with a link to the webinar. You can watch it anytime you want. But I appreciate it, and I appreciate your Green Your Lab website. That's it's amazing. So I hope everybody signs up for that.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Chris.
All right. Well, we'll talk to you guys later. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.